Shalom, my family, my friends, what is going on? And we have part two, I guess you can say, of this hell series. First, we looked at hell and we saw that hell is the grave. Hell is the pit. Hell is a grave, and sleep is when a man dies. That's what we looked at in the first study. And now we'll be looking at hell. We'll be looking at a few things with it. So we're going to look at the second meaning of hell. Hell's second meaning. When the fire happens, as we talked about in the first video, that when a man dies, he doesn't go directly to heaven, and he doesn't go directly to hell fire if he is lost. He is waiting on either one, the first or the second resurrection, right? So we're looking at hell's second meaning, when the fire happens, the second death, and the two resurrections. I know it seems like a lot, but we're going to try to fit it all into this video because they all have something to do with one another. Hell's second meaning, when the fire happens, the second death, and the two resurrections. So let's get right into it, okay? As I just said briefly, when the fire happens, because as we looked at in the first study, when a man dies, he does not go immediately to heaven. He does not go immediately to hell or hellfire, as we'll look at in this study, because the man goes to the grave, or he goes to hell, Sheol, which is the pit or the grave. And when a man is dead, the Bible says that the man is sleeping. And if you didn't watch the first video, check that one out so it'll make sense. Now we're going to be looking at the second meaning of hell, along with a few other things. All right, so when we look at the word hell, this second meaning of hell, we can get the meaning from it in the New Testament or in the Greek, which goes back to the Old Testament. I'll say it one more time. We can get the meaning of hellfire in what is called the New Testament, and it takes us back to the old. What do I mean by that? So the word hellfire, when it speaks about the fire in the scriptures, it's called hell, but that word is called Gehenna. Gehenna in the Greek, okay? And I'm going to read this statement, and I quote, "Hell is the place of future punishment called Gehenna, or Gehenna of fire. This was originally the valley of Hinnom, in South Jerusalem, where the filth and dead animals of the city were cast out and burned." And it says it was a fit symbol of the wicked and their future destruction. So this is about the hellfire, and it's interesting that they keep saying that this hell is in the future. It's not anything that's present. It doesn't have to, when a man dies, he goes to the pit or the grave, and he's waiting on the first or the second resurrection. I'm going to read this again. G 10:27, when we see the word hell in the scriptures. When we're going to look at some of the things that the Messiah said 3 times when he talked about it. He was speaking of not the grave or the pit. He was speaking of hell, fire. That's the fire. But Gehenna, it says hell is the place of future punishment called Gehenna, or Gehenna of fire. This was originally the valley of Hinnom in South Jerusalem, where the filth and dead animals of the city were cast out and burned, a fit symbol of the wicked and their future destruction, right? So it says this Gehenna of fire was originally the valley of Hinnom, okay, the valley of Hinnom. And if we look at these, just 2 out of the few verses where it uses this same word, I think it's H2011. If you want to look at this in a Strong's Concordance, I think it's H2011, this word Hinnom, which is where we get the word in the Greek, Gehenna, or Gehenna of fire. Watch what happens in this valley of Hinnom, where we get this word, where the Greek gets the word Gehenna, was originally the valley of Hinnom. Watch what happens in the context of these verses. So in 2 Chronicles 28, verse 3, it says, "Moreover, he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burnt his children in the fire." So this is something that they were doing in the scriptures. This is something that, let me try to go to it. 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 3. 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 3. And it's speaking of Ahaz. Ahaz, verse 1, Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not that which was right in the sight of Yah, like David his father. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and made molten images. Then it goes into verse 3. Moreover, he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burnt his children in the fire after the abominations of the heathen whom Yah had cast out before the children of Israel. But we see what happens in this valley of Hinnom. He burnt incense in the valley of Hinnom, in the Greek Gehenna, or place of fire, and it says, and burnt his children in the fire. So we see what happens in this valley of Hinnom. Second witness, Jeremiah 7 verse 31. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. This is something that happened in the valley of Hinnom. Things were burnt. And when the children of Israel were living and doing wickedly before the Most High, it says they would take their sons and their daughters and they would burn them in the fire in the valley of Hinnom, or the valley of the son of Hinnom. This is why the Greek takes this from the Hebrew, this valley of Hinnom, and it speaks of, and it's called Gehenna in the Greek, Gehenna. All right? So now we're going to look at the word Gehenna and how it's used in the New Testament. This isn't the grave. This isn't the pit. That first meaning of hell, or Sheol in the Hebrew, this is actually hell fire. This is the hell fire. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10 first. And this is Yeshua speaking. In verse 28, it says, and fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell, or in Gehenna. So this is the Messiah speaking about hell fire. Matthew 10, 28, fear not those who can destroy body, but fear him who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, or hell fire, right? So we go to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18 now. And he's basically he's basically explaining how a man or a woman, how we should view sin. Verse 9, it says, if thine eye offend thee. When we look at the word offend, the word offend in the Greek means to cause to stumble or to cause to sin. Verse 9, if thy eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with one eye rather than having two eyes to be cast into hell fire. And that word right there is Gehenna. So we see the Messiah is talking about hell fire, right? Matthew 23, verse 33. Matthew 23, verse 33, we were speaking with, if I'm not mistaken, the Judeans, the Pharisees, and things of that nature. When we go down to verse 33, it says, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? He says, how can you escape the damnation of Gehenna? So he was speaking to these people, and he was saying, how can you escape the damnation of hell? He wasn't talking about the grave or the pit. He was literally talking about hell fire. He was talking about that place, hell fire, right? And he told them, how can you escape the damnation or the condemnation of hellfire? Now, that verse makes a lot of sense because that word, of course, damnation is G2920 when we look at it in the Greek. And that's the same word that he uses in 3 verses. And this is going to make sense as we go into the second resurrection. Add a little bit over here. So in Matthew 23, verse 33, Yeshua says, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation or the condemnation of hell, or hell fire? That's what that word is in the Greek, Gehenna. But when he says damnation, it's the same as condemnation, right? So let's go to Mark chapter 3, verse 29, just to see how he uses this word damnation right here, and it's going to make sense. Mark chapter 3, verse 29, it says, but he that shall blaspheme against the Holy Spirit hath never forgiveness, but is in danger of eternal damnation. So right here in Mark chapter 3, it says, the man who blasphemes the Spirit of Yah is in danger of eternal damnation, which damnation means condemnation. Okay, that's what that means. Damnation means condemnation, or if a man or a woman is condemned. All right, so 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. The same word is used. And then we're going to go to the one in John, which is going to usher us into the next section. 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, it says, "But the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." So right there, that word judgment in 2 Peter 3, verse 7 is the same word for damnation or condemnation, right? In the Greek, they're all the same words. And we're going to come back to this verse. It's going to be very important, 2 Peter 3, verse 7. All right, so now let's go to John 5, verse 29. This is going to push us into the next section. John chapter 5, verse 29. Because the Messiah said in Matthew 23:33, "How you vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell," which is condemnation. Now we're going to see what he's talking about right here in John 5:29. So I'll start at 28. In John chapter 5, it says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation." So right here in John chapter 5, verse 29, the Messiah speaks of two resurrections, right? John 5:25-29, he says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of Elohim, and they that hear shall live. For as the Father has life in himself, so has he given the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice." Whose voice? The Son of Elohim. Verse 25. Now we're in verse 29. "And shall come forth they that have done good into the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil into the resurrection of damnation," which is condemnation or judgment. The same word. All right, so we see in John 5:25-29, specifically verse 29, he speaks of two resurrections. He speaks of two resurrections, okay? He speaks of two resurrections. And what he says, this is going to be very important. The first one, he said, that they that have done good into the resurrection of life. This one is labeled the resurrection of life. The second one is labeled the resurrection of damnation. And that same word damnation is used for condemnation. So this tells us something about the two resurrections. If a man is not in the first resurrection, the second resurrection, Yeshua said out of his own mouth that it is the resurrection of damnation, right? So we want to be a part of the first resurrection. All right, so let's look at the book of Daniel now. The book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 12. Starting at verse 1, going into verse 2. "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So we see right here, Daniel says the same thing. Where do we think Yeshua? Of course, he's the son of Yah. But Yeshua, of course, we know he knows the scriptures. Daniel says the same things. He speaks about two resurrections. One, the first one, he says, some shall awake to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. So Daniel, verse 1 and 2, he speaks of two resurrections. The first one is a blessing. The second one is not. All right? Let's go to the book of Acts. Let's go to the book of Acts, chapter 24. Acts chapter 24. The book of Acts, chapter 24. What's interesting, even in this Acts chapter 24, they were accusing Paul. They may have been speaking about the resurrection or something, but they were on Paul a lot of times about the law, as if he was against YAH'S law or YAH'S Torah. But it's interesting in Acts 24, verse 14 and 15, he says, "But this I confess unto thee," which is his confession, "that after the way which they call heresy, so I worship the Elohim of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." So Paul was, of course, not against the Father's law, or he was not against the prophets, or the Messiah would not have chosen him to do this work that he did, which was a great work. But in verse 15 it says, "And have hope toward Elohim, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust." So we see these two resurrections right here. Paul even says it. Verse 15, "And have we hope toward Elohim, which they themselves also allow, that there should be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust." If there is a resurrection also of the dead, both the just and the unjust, when a man dies, if we're resurrected out of the graves, what is a man doing in the kingdom before he's resurrected? We're resurrected from the grave. We're resurrected from the grave, not from heaven. We're resurrected from the grave, right? So in Revelation chapter 20, now we're in Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20. The Bible says this, starting at verse 4. "And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them." Revelation 20, verse 4. "And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Yeshua, and for the word of Elohim, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Messiah 1,000 years." Verse 5. "But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." Stop right there. So it says the people in verse 5, they're the ones who lived and reigned with, verse 4, they're the ones who lived and reigned with the Messiah for 1,000 years. Then it says in verse 5, "But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished." The rest of the dead. That's the second resurrection. All right? That's the second resurrection. After the 1,000 years. The second resurrection is after the 1,000 years. All right? Then in verse 6, we'll finish in verse 5. It says, "But the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years are finished." This is the first resurrection. "Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power. But they shall be priests of Elohim and of the Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." Right? So in verse 6 it says, "Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power." But when we look at the second death, which we'll look at that in just a few seconds, we'll look at the second death. But going into verse 7 it says, "And when the 1,000 years are expired," when the 1,000 years are expired, now we're about to start going into when the fire happens. When the fire happens, it says, "And when the 1,000 years are expired." What 1,000 years? The first 1,000 years. Because when the Messiah comes back, he's going to take us, he's going to bring us to himself. And it says we go into the dead in the Messiah shall rise first. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, let's just go there real fast. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 15. "For this we say unto you by the word of Yah, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Master shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Master himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of Elohim, and the dead in Messiah shall rise first." So the dead that's in the Messiah, they shall rise first. Remember, the dead in Messiah, those who are in him, they shall rise first. Verse 17, "Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds." So the dead in the Messiah rises first, and then those who are alive, if a man or a woman is alive when he comes back, they're going to be caught up with them, the dead who rose, in the air. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. What happens when the Messiah comes back? When we look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7 and 8. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7, 8, and 9. This explains exactly what happens when the Messiah comes back. Right? Because we just saw in 1 Thessalonians 4 that the dead in the Messiah are going to rise first. And then those who are still alive will meet him in the air. So when Yeshua comes back, if a man is not in Messiah, what happens when Yeshua comes back? 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7 through 9. It says, "And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Master Yeshua shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels." 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 7. So it says, rest with us when Yeshua shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. This is Matthew chapter 24, when he says the light shall shine from the east to the west, and he's going to come back with his angels. Right? So this is what Paul is saying right here. Verse 7, "And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Master Yeshua shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels." Verse 8, "In flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not Elohim, and that obey not the gospel of our Master, Yeshua the Messiah, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of Yah and from the glory of his power." So it says when he comes back, men are going to be destroyed by his presence and the glory of his power. By his presence, right? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8 says the same thing. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Master shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming." Right? So when the Messiah comes back, you have some people who are going to be destroyed by the brightness of his coming. They're going to die. And you have some people, the dead in the Messiah, are going to rise first. And then you have those who are alive are going to meet him in the air. Right? This is at his coming. People are going to be destroyed at the Messiah's coming. Clearly it says from these two verses. At the brightness of his coming, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. Then 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7. "And to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Master Yeshua shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not Elohim and that obey not the gospel." Right? "Who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Master and from the glory of his power." So that's what happens the second the Messiah comes back, right? So when we go into when this fire happens, going back to Revelation 20 now, when this fire happens, because we know all shall hear his voice, both the wicked and the just, both the righteous and the unrighteous hear his voice. It says that in John chapter 5, all shall hear his voice and come out of the grave. So when we look at this in Revelation 20, verse 7, it says, "And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are on the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea." I don't know exactly what time frame this happens, but it says when these 1,000 years are expired, Satan will be loosed out of his prisons and shall gather and deceive the nations. How are the nations alive when the Messiah comes back? If they're destroyed at the brightness of his coming, right? That's what the Bible says. When the Messiah comes back, men are going to be destroyed at the brightness of his coming. Those who are not in Messiah, how are they now alive right here? Because he resurrects them. John 5, all shall hear his voice. So after these 1,000 years, as he says in John chapter 5, everybody's going to hear his voice. He doesn't distinguish between who. In John 5:28, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil to the resurrection of damnation. But the second resurrection is after the 1,000 years." Revelation 20, verse 5. Going into verse 7, right? So they're raised up at some point when the Messiah raises them up after the 1,000 years, the wicked, or those who are a part of this second resurrection. Verse 8 in Revelation 20 says, "And shall go out to deceive the nations, which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from Elohim out of heaven, and devoured them." So when does this fire happen? Revelation 20 verse 9 says, well, in the context of Revelation 20 verse 7 through 9, it says after the 1,000 years. Does that line up with scripture, other scriptures? Let's go to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. What did Yeshua say in his parable? Matthew chapter 13, verse 36 through 40, when the disciples asked him, he spoke so many parables in Matthew 13, but this is the one that they asked him about, so we should, of course, give attention to this one. Verse 36, it says, Then Yeshua sent the multitude away. Then Yeshua sent the multitude away and went into the house. And his disciples came unto him, saying, Declare unto us, or make known to us, the parable of the tares of the field. Verse 37, he answered and said unto them, He that soweth, or he that sows the good seed, is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. Verse 39, the enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. Verse 40, as therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. So Yeshua says, so shall it be in the end of this world, or in the end of the world. When does the fire come? Because he says, in the end of the world. Matthew 13:40, as therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. That's what Yeshua said. When does the fire come? The end of this world. We see it in Revelation 20 verse 9, after the 1,000 years. Let's look at 2 Peter chapter 3 now. 2 Peter chapter 3. We're going back to 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3, we're going to look at verse 7. It says, But the heavens and the earth, which are now, we see the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word are kept in store, reserved, not right now, it says reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. When did we see that happen? In Revelation 20. After the 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years. So, when Peter says that in verse 7, but the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire. It's reserved. We know what a reservation is. If we reserve a hotel for Tuesday or Thursday or something like that, we're already basically paying for it now. And today is a Monday. We're paying for it now, but we're reserving it for this day. So when it gets to that day, that's when we get it. Okay, but I'm sure you may already know what reserve means. But he says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Right? So this fire is reserved. This is not something that happens the second a man dies. But we do see the Messiah speaking about Gehenna fire. He spoke about hellfire, Matthew 10:28, Matthew 18:9, Matthew 23:33. He speaks about damnation. In John 5, verse 29, when he speaks about these two resurrections, the Messiah says the first one is the resurrection of life, and the second one is the resurrection of damnation or condemnation or judgment. That's the second resurrection. We don't want to be a part of that one. We do not want to be a part of that one. Right? So, and the second death is connected to this second resurrection as well, I believe. And if you have other thoughts, leave it in the comments. But I believe the second death is connected to the second resurrection, because he says it's a resurrection of damnation or condemnation. That is when a man is damned or a man is condemned, right? So this second death, if we look at the second death in the book of Revelation chapter 20, verse 14 and 15, Revelation 20, verse 14 and 15, it says, and death, this is the grave, death and hell, the grave, were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So in verse 14 and 15, it says, death and hell, the grave, were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is reserved. What's reserved for the lake of fire is death, hell, and those who are not written in the book of life. Revelation 20, verse 14 and 15. If we go to Revelation 21, verse 7 and 8, it says, he that overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his Elohim, and he shall be my son. Verse 8, but the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake, which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Okay, we see that it's naming those attributes of a man or woman's life. If they're practicing these things, they're in danger and can be in danger of this lake of fire, which is the second death, right? The fearful, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, whoremongers, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So that would mean that these men are not written in the book of life. And that's exactly what he said in Revelation 20, verse 15. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. But then in 21, verse 8, he names these things and says, they shall go to the lake of fire. Right? So when we read Revelation 22, verse 14 and 15, it says, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. For without where? Without the city, right? Blessed are they who do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, verse 14, and may enter in through the gates into the city. Verse 15, for without the city are dogs and sorcerers, whoremongers, murderers, and idolaters, and whosoever loves and makes a lie. Some of those same attributes were written in Revelation 21, verse 8, with the same people that actually go to the lake of fire. So what it looks to me like is the second death or the second resurrection, which we saw in Revelation chapter 20, verse 9, and they that went up on the breadth of the earth encompassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city. Fire came down from Elohim out of heaven and devoured them. Right? And who is this? Verse 7, when the 1,000 years are expired. Verse 5, but the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. On such, the second death has no power. But we saw Revelation 22, verse 15, the second death has power over them. Revelation 21, verse 8, the second death has power over them. Right? So we need to be in this first resurrection. This first resurrection. Right? So I pray this study bless you. Gehenna, this is the hellfire. This isn't the grave. As we looked at on the first study, Gehenna, hellfire. We looked at its original word is the valley of Hinnom. And we look at that in the Hebrew. When we look at that in 2 Chronicles 28, verse 3, it says, in this valley of the son of Hinnom, people were burnt and thrown into the fire. They were throwing their children into the fire, which is, of course, is wicked. But we see the context of how they got this word Gehenna in the Greek from the word Hinnom, which was south of Jerusalem, where things were burned and cast into this burning pit or whatever it is. Right? We looked at how the Messiah used it, Matthew 10, 28, Matthew 18, verse 9, Matthew 23, verse 33. We looked at the two resurrections, one for life, as Daniel said, everlasting life, and one for everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2, we looked at what the Messiah said, the two resurrections. The first one was for life. The second one was for damnation, or to be condemned or judged. We saw Acts 24, verse 14 and 15. Verse 15, Paul said there is two resurrections, one for the just and one for the unjust. We saw in Revelation 20, verse 5 and 6, that blessed is the one who enters into the first resurrection, for on such the second death has no power. We just saw the second death in Revelation 20, verse 14 and 15. Verse 15, it says, and those who were not written in the book of life were cast into the fire. So we see the casting into the fire is connected with the second death. The same with the sins mentioned in Revelation 21, verse 8. Those who practice those things, the scripture says they go to the lake of fire. Then we saw in Revelation 22, verse 14, blessed are they who keep his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter into the city. through the gates of the city, but without or for without, it speaks of these same things that was mentioned in Revelation 21:8, that those attributes, of those characteristics, those lifestyles of those men are mentioned in Revelation 21 verse 8. So I assume and I believe the text is saying they too, those who are without, are going to be a part of the second death or the second resurrection or condemnation. As we saw in Revelation 20 verse 9, after the 1,000 years, it came up upon the city and fire came down out of heaven from Yah. Right? So I pray this study blessed you. If you have any comments, if you feel different, feel free to comment in the description box so we can talk about it. I pray you're blessed by this study. I pray it helps you, and I pray you have a wonderful day. Shalom.